Hey everybody, it's Idre here, and this you won't see my face in this video because I had to use something else to screen record this, and you guys already see the lowest ranking one, but I'm going to be ranking every Depeche Mode album from worst to best. Now keep in mind, I love Depeche Mode, so even the worst is decent. For example, this one, Construction Time Again, even though I have this at the bottom of the 14 albums, it still gets a 59, around a 6 out of 100, or 60 out of 100, so it's around a 6 out of 10. So if you know my reviews, you know that is still a decent review. But why is Construction Time Again down at number 14? Well, for me, this marks the lowest point in their career, not because they were just making horrible music, but because they had yet to figure out what they were doing. Um, they really wanted to transition into the more industrial sound, so there is a lot more industry sounds on this thing. Obviously, this contains songs like Everything Counts, but there's a lot of, I guess you could say, filler throughout this thing. There's a lot of songs of them just messing around with the sounds. And, well, I appreciate everything that this album offers. It's just underwhelming compared to some other work. This is why this album ranks down at number 14. Not because it's bad, but just because it's the least impressive. It's a little too much of them trying to find out what their sound's going to be. But coming in at number 13 comes Sounds of the Universe. This album is produced well. The overall songs in general are pretty solid. I think this thing does contain a good amount of solid songs. My only issue with it is that the set list is a slight bit more sporadic than some of the other albums they have put out, especially even in more recent times. I think that the track list is a bit sloppy here and there. There are a few tracks that kind of do drag this project down a slight bit. That being said, I think that they did a good job with the production. I think that the sounds used on here are really good. I think the opening track is one of their best opening tracks. I think that overall, this album, I give it around a 63 out of 100. Pretty average, pretty good, but just their other stuff, it's a bit better. Coming in at number 12 is Speak and Spell. Speak and Spell is one of those kind of weirder albums, I guess you could say, because you feel weird putting it too high because it's their debut, but you also feel weird putting it any lower. But this sits down at number 12, really for the fact that this is the most dated sounding Depeche Mode album, even if the content actually is pretty good. I think this is one of the better synth pop albums from the early 80s, and I think that it's a fine album. My only issue with it is the fact that compared to even some of their 80s work, this one hasn't aged quite as well. But despite that, this album does contain some great songs that really foreshadow what was to come. Obviously, Just Can't Get Enough's the big hit, but I think songs like Puppets are also really strong that often, unfortunately, get overlooked. I think Speak and Spell, sitting around 66 out of 100. We're entering the better parts now. Coming in at number 11 is Exciter from 2001. This is definitely Depeche Mode at their most experimental. I gave it around a 7 out of 10. But yeah, this thing it took a long time to grow on me. I was a lot more hesitant to really get into this thing at first just because it was such a big departure from the sound that I was used to. But, and especially coming off of an album like Ultra, which is one of my personal favorites, it's a little disappointing. But, the more I listen, the more I analyze, the more I look deeper into this album, the more I get more and more out of it. I think that it, is nice to hear them explore something a little different because they haven't really done much of this since then or before then. And I think that the use of acoustic guitar throughout this thing is also pretty innovative. I think that overall Dave sounds really good here. I love his more unique singing than on a lot of other Depeche Mode tracks. Overall, this thing is pretty solid. Don't get me wrong. But the only thing keeping it from cracking the top 10 on this list is I think the fact that their experimentation sometimes took away from some of the quality of some of these tracks, just a slight bit, and I think that hurts this album just a slight little bit. But it would be nice to hear these songs revised, revisited, and maybe even played live a few times. But Here we are, Exciter at 11. We have entered the top 10 with Some Great Reward coming in at number 10. This one may get some fans a little pissed off because this is one of Depeche Mode's more popular albums, but I have some mixed feelings on why I put it here. It's not below the top 10 because this album is one of the most consistently good track lists the band's ever put out. But it doesn't rank that much higher than where it's at because even though this album was good and kind of revolutionary for its time, the band has progressed on to make bigger and better albums. And that doesn't hurt the content of this album, though, which is something I want to make clear. Even though I do think that they went on to record better stuff, the content here is still good. I mean, this thing, it takes what I like about Construction Time Again and polishes it into a more complete and cohesive sound, which I will always get behind. I give this around 75 out of 100, which is pretty good review. Obviously, People Are People's on here, but so are some deep cuts, which I quite enjoy, such as Stories of Old. Overall, this album is really nice, but much like kind of Speak and Spell, sometimes this album does sound a slight bit more less innovative as the years go on compared to some of their other albums. But this is a great album. I don't have much negative to say here. It's just I believe there is at least 9 more that I think are slightly better. Coming in at number 9 is Delta Machine. Delta Machine is one of those albums which splits fans down the middle. I've seen people praise it. I've seen people dislike it openly. I've seen people put this at the bottom of the list. And we are approaching the middle of this list more, so we are kind of in this middle territory. Delta Machine, to me, is one of the more interesting albums, or one of the more interesting projects I've heard from them, especially considering this was coming off of Sounds of the Universe, which is one that I wasn't as crazy about. But Delta Machine is a nice return to form. I gave this one around a 77, 78 out of 10, or out of 100, just below that 8 out of 10 range. This album is extremely good, I really do quite like the blues style influence that's throughout this thing. I think it fits Dave's voice, and I think it fits Martin's simplistic guitar playing very well. I do, however, think there are a few songs on here which I think follow too stereotypically into the blues territory, where it kind of loses touch of Depeche Mode, but such on songs like Slow. But for the most part, they pretty successfully executed this sound, this style, and I quite like it, and I think it's one of the most interesting things they've done in a while. It's unique, and it comes together quite well, and I think the bonus tracks are actually quite well as well. I really enjoy this album. I guess any small issues I would have to just say, every now and then it does feel a little stereotypical of a blues album, but besides that, I think they did a decent job executing these tracks, and this is why it places on the top 10 at number 9. But coming in at number 8 is Playing the Angel. Playing the Angel is, as more years go by, the more this album, I believe, is deemed as being a classic, and understandably so. Coming off of the more experimental Exciter, Depeche Mode would return in 2005 with a much more straightforward album, a much more, I don't want to say raw, but a much more dance-oriented album, much more up-tempo album, but also a relatively darker album. There's a lot of dark songs on this thing that I feel do not get the attention they deserve. For instance, I have always felt that songs such as Nothing's Impossible, Damaged People, The Darkest Star, and Suffer Well are some of the darkest Depeche Mode songs, especially of the 21st century. A lot of people do have issues with the production on this thing, and I get that with the compression at least, but for the most part, I think this album is extremely solid. This is a 9 out of 10 for me. We are entering the top tier Depeche Mode albums now. And excellent album, without a doubt, in my opinion. I think this one will go down more and more as time goes on as an interesting point in their career where they kind of looked back at some of that dance stuff and modernized it. This is a very modern-sounding album, at least for 2005, and really was taking that old classic Depeche Mode sound and perfecting it in the modern world. And I think that's a great thing to do, and I think it comes together perfectly. Coming in at number 7, I'm probably going to get a lot of hate for this, is Songs of Faith and Devotion. This album is often placed towards the top, if not the top, of many people's lists. So what is it about this album that prevents it from being number 1, or around the top 3, per se? I feel like they were in a dark time here, and I feel like even though it represents that era of their life perfectly and of their career, my only issue with it is just the fact that ever since Ultra came out and they've progressed on and recorded good, like, more good albums and everything, the cracks that appear on this album have been beginning to show much more from the songwriting and all that. There's a few cracks here and there that I think crack through a little bit more. But and I honestly think this is pretty on par with Playing the Angel in my personal opinion. But for the most part, this album is extremely solid. Obviously, this contains classic Depeche Mode songs like I Feel You, Walking in My Shoes, Condemnation, all that. But I think what's more important about this album is the fact that this album almost probably didn't even happen, considering where they were, considering what was going on. So placing it at 7 may look a little low, but this is still like a decent score. I still give this 9 out of 10. I just do personally feel like they would go on to make some better stuff, and I feel like some of the stuff before was a bit better. Overall, I think Songs of Faith and Devotion was a greatly put together album, and let's move on to number 6, Spirit. This is gonna be controversial because Spirit has split fans down the middle. I see people praise this thing. I see people hate on this thing. I, for one, think that the more and more and more I listen to this album, the more and more and more I realize this album is an important part of their career and is just an important album. I give this a 92 out of 100. This is a hugely success in my eyes. I think that not only are the lyrics extremely relevant in today's society, I think that musically this is one of their greatest produced albums that I've really in their entire career. The only thing keeping this from reaching the top 5 is that I do think that some of the songs may not be as up to par, maybe, but for the most part, you know, you have an extremely solid track list and an extremely solid album. Obviously, the 2 main singles that promoted this thing were Going Backwards and Where's the Revolution, 2 songs that are extremely relevant in today's society. But you even have more introspective songs, such as Cover Me, and more dark songs, some of the darkest songs in their entire career, such as The Worst Crime. I mean, these are songs that a band usually would have made early on in their career, but Depeche Mode pulls it off on their 14th album. I think Spirit will go down throughout their career as one of the more important albums, one of the better albums. I think that this is a pretty solidly good album, and yeah, I have no regrets putting it at number 6. Coming in at number 5 is A Broken Frame. This is another one that I see put down a lot, often getting criticized for being a transitional record. But to me, it's just so impressive how this album even came to be so good. Considering Speak and Spell, well, not bad, was still very primitive, was still very analog sounding. Obviously, this still is analog, but it just has a much more fuller sound, from the more full sounding drums to the more rounded synths to the more soothing vocals to the more well put together songs. And in all honesty, this album consists of some of Depeche Mode's more experimental early work, some of their weirder ones, such as Shouldn't Have Done That, Satellite, and Monument, all songs that you will never find on a single album like that. I think A Broken Frame ages extremely well. Even the songs that are more pop-friendly, such as A Photograph of You, they at least have good music to back it up. And I think that with Martin adopting songwriting roles after Vince had left the band, I think that this was a good kicking stone or whatever, stepping stone for them to get, to move forward. I think this is roughly like a 95 out of 100. This is a great album. I love the sound of it. I love the atmosphere of this album. I think it all came together really good, and I don't get why people like to put this one so low. But coming in at number 4 is Ultra, 1997's Ultra, the first album that doesn't feature Alan Wilder on there, and they made it absolutely fantastic. And I think that this proves my point that Depeche Mode can still be good, even without Alan. Obviously, I ranked Spirit pretty high, and I had a pretty positive review for Playing the Angel Delta Machine. But Ultra, to me, is really what kicked off this new era of Depeche Mode. This is an album that shouldn't have happened, considering the band was still recovering from all the craziness in the 90s and was still recovering from the loss of a pretty major and important member, and yet they managed to pull off one of their best albums to date. I think this is one of their most solid track lists. I think this is one of their most cohesive sounds. I think the deep cuts on this thing are phenomenal. The bottom line is one of my favorite Martin sung songs. Sisters of Night or Sister of Night is one of my favorite more slow Depeche Mode songs. Then you have songs like Useless, which are much more blues rock inspired. For the most part, you get a really solid album, a really well put together dark sound, with some of their darkest material, and I think that it comes together in a great package and is one of their greatest albums. The only thing preventing it from being number one is just the solid holy trinity of albums, which I'm about to cover. Coming in at number three is Music for the Masses, the second, technically, of the holy trinity of albums here. But yeah, this takes what is great about Black Celebration, but translates it over more to a live setting. Because as much as I love Black Celebration, some of those songs don't translate as well in a live setting. Music for the Masses, though, takes that sound and style and really transforms them into great pieces of works that work great in a live setting. And hence why they sound so good on Depeche Mode 101. But this is a pretty flawless track list. The only thing that's keeping it lower than the top two is really, I would argue, sometimes songs like Behind the Wheel, some of the more dance songs, do feel a bit empty every now and then, like they left a lot of space in the mix. But for the most part, I have almost nothing negative to say about this album. From this point, it's just which album do I like more based on my mood. But yeah, this album's solid. Ain't much negative to say here. One of their most cohesive sounds they've ever done. And great production on here, too. The production is phenomenal on Music for the Masses. And yeah, coming in at number two is Black Celebration. This should be expected. If you know, you probably know what I'm talking about when I'm saying the holy trinity of the Depeche Mode albums. But this is such an improvement compared to literally everything else they had done so far in the 80s. Even a Broken Frame, which I rank really high. Black Celebration is such a great album. It takes everything they had done up to that point and puts it in one album with a much more darker undertone, and it makes for one of the most epic experiences in music. And I think this album is a huge reason why they have a huge cult following today. There isn't much else to say about this album that I didn't already say in my review, but solid track list. And one of the things I love about this album is that they didn't care as much about the live thing. While I praise Music for the Masses for having a good live sound, this one never really cared much about being live or any of that. And it leads to some of the more interesting songs on this album, like Sometimes, which is a really echoey piano song. You know, you have Here Is the House. You have songs, a bunch of short songs that are sung by Martin, but this is an album that's not a song-by-song album, but a full album listen experience. Like, if you want to get this album to its fullest potential, you need to listen to it all the way through. Even if some of the songs don't work great on their own, I mean, the album as a whole comes together perfectly. Which leaves me with one more album, which you guys already know what it is, even though it's the stereotypical pick. Violator is one of the most perfectly put together albums I've heard my entire life. It is arguably my favorite album of all time, because everything I like about the band, everything I like about the 80s, everything I like about the 90s, all comes together in this one album. Not only is this album loaded with one of the most solid track lists of any album from any artist, it's just so well put together, it's so well produced, everything about it is really solid, and there's almost nothing bad to say about this thing. I honestly have almost nothing negative to say about this album. It's a solid 10 out of 10 for me. It's from the opening riffs, opening synths on World of My Eyes to the closing bass riff of Clean. This album is consistent all the way through it. The band's tight. The writing's perfect. The production's perfect. Dave's vocals, Martin's vocals, all they're playing, it all comes together in a great package. This is the go-to album for me. No matter what I'm listening to, no matter what I'm getting into or discovering at the time, I can always come back to Violator. I can always come back to most of these albums. I can come back to Black Celebration, Ultra, Spirit, especially Spirit. I can come back to a lot of these albums. But Violator always, to me, is the crowning jewel on their discography and on music in general. So yeah, that is my list of ranking Depeche Mode albums. What are your opinions on this? Keep in mind, literally everything above Some Great Reward has at least like a 75 out of 100 or higher, which is extremely positive. I think Depeche Mode has one of the most solid discographies of any group. But yeah, that's it for now. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and see you next time. Hopefully you actually see my face next time.